Welcome to the deep dive. We're doing something a bit different today, going beyond the usual highlights of Scottish philosophy. So,
hmm
past the big names like Hume and Reid, we're diving deep into the 19th century,
Hmm.
a period that's often overshadowed, I think, uh, but it's so incredibly important for understanding how Scottish thought evolved.
Yeah, it's fascinating how much happens in this era. It's like a philosophy's equivalent of those deleted scenes you find on a DVD. Crucial for the full story.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to really get a handle on the major players, their core ideas, and why this whole period matters.
Right.
And our main source for this deep dive is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on 19th century Scottish philosophy. It's a treasure trove of information. But before we get totally lost in the 1800s, should we do a quick recap of the Scottish Enlightenment,
Uh-huh.
just to kind of set the stage?
Absolutely. You can't really understand the 19th century without knowing what these philosophers were reacting to. It's like trying to appreciate a sequel without having seen the original movie.
Right, so refresh my memory a bit.
Right.
What were the major fault lines, let's say, in the Scottish Enlightenment?
Well, there were two main camps. On one side, you have the Berkeleyan system, which prioritized philosophical rigor, but it could sometimes lead to skepticism.
Right.
This is where someone like David Hume fits in,
Yes.
famously questioning our knowledge of the external world and the nature of causality.
Hume. Always the one to poke holes in our comfortable certainties. But wasn't there a counter-movement to all that skepticism?
Oh, there was. That's where you get the Hutchisonian system, named after Francis Hutcheson thinkers in this camp like Thomas Reid,
Yeah.
put a huge premium on common sense and everyday experience.
Right.
They argue that we do have direct knowledge of the world and our faculties of perception are generally reliable.
Okay, so a clash between skepticism and common sense. That seems like a pretty fundamental philosophical divide. But despite their differences, did these two camps have anything in common?
They did. Both were interested in creating a science of mind. They wanted to apply rigorous methods to understanding how our minds work, even if they disagreed on what those methods should be. And this shared goal is a key link to the 19th century, where the focus shifts from broad social and political questions to a more concentrated study of logic and perception.
So less about how should society be structured and more about how do we even know anything at all?
Exactly. And as we move into the 19th century, we see new voices emerging, each trying to grapple with the legacy of Hume and Reid in their own unique way.
Okay, I'm ready to meet these philosophical trailblazers. Who kicks off our 19th century lineup?
That would be Thomas Browne, who held the chair of moral philosophy at Edinburgh starting in 1810. Browne was a fascinating figure, a poet, physician, and philosopher all rolled into one.
A true Renaissance man. I bet that multifaceted background really influenced his philosophy.
It definitely did. Now, Browne is interesting because he attempts to bridge the gap between Hume and Reid. He sees the intellectual appeal of both positions and tries to find some common ground.
Trying to synthesize skepticism and common sense. That's a tough challenge. Did he have any specific insights on how to do that?
He did. There's this great quote from Browne where he compares Hume and Reid's positions so vividly. He says that Reid bawled out that we must believe in an external world, but then whispered that we can't really provide a solid reason for that belief. And meanwhile, Hume, he cries out that we can't justify our belief in the external world, and then he whispers that we can't shake off the belief either.
Wow, that's a brilliant way to capture the tension between those two viewpoints. It sounds like Browne recognized that both skepticism and common sense have a certain pull on us.
Exactly. And this leads him to explore this fundamental distinction between direct realism and hypothetical realism.
Okay, break those down for me. What's the difference between the two?
Direct realism, which was championed by Reid, argues that we perceive the external world directly without any intermediary steps. It's like looking through a clear window, as you said earlier. Hypothetical realism, on the other hand, suggests that we can only infer the existence of an external world based on our perceptions, which are mental representations. It's more like seeing a reflection in a mirror. We're not directly accessing the object itself.
So Browne is wrestling with this question of how much we can truly know about the world beyond our own minds. Did his work spark a whole new philosophical movement?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Although Browne's lectures were immensely popular in his time, his influence waned after the mid-19th century. His nuanced take on Hume may not have really resonated with the prevailing philosophical trends.
That's kind of sad. It's like he was a bright star that burned out too quickly. So who stepped into the philosophical spotlight after Browne's influence faded?
That's where Sir William Hamilton enters the picture. He became a towering figure in Scottish philosophy, both at home and internationally.
Hamilton. He sounds like a major player. What made him so influential?
Imagine a philosopher steeped in the Scottish tradition, having studied under Reid's students, but also deeply familiar with Kant's ideas.
So he's blending Scottish and German philosophical traditions. That's an interesting mix. How did that play out in his work?
So Hamilton becomes this unique figure who champions Reid's common sense philosophy while engaging with the complexities of Kantian thought. He's walking this tightrope between these two major philosophical schools.
That's quite a balancing act. What were some of his key contributions to this philosophical conversation?
One of his most important concepts is the idea of the unconditioned. He uses this idea to try and overcome the limitations of both phenomenalism and presentationism.
Yeah, I'm going to need you to unpack that for me. What exactly is the unconditioned, and how does it relate to those other philosophical ideas?
Think about it this way. Our understanding of the world is always limited by our senses and our capacity for reason. We're always looking at things from a particular conditioned perspective. But Hamilton argues that there's an underlying reality, the unconditioned, that transcends our limited human understanding.
So it's like the ultimate ground of reality, something we can't fully grasp, but that we're always striving to understand.
You got it. And this concept of the unconditioned sparked a lot of debate thinkers. Like John Stuart Mill and Hutchison Sterling critiqued Hamilton's ideas, leading to these very lively philosophical exchanges.
It sounds like Hamilton really pushed the boundaries of philosophical thought. Did he manage to resolve this long-standing debate between skepticism and common sense?
Well, philosophy is less about finding definitive answers and more about exploring different perspectives and pushing the limits of what we can think about. And Hamilton certainly did that, even if he didn't provide a neat resolution to the whole Hume-Reid standoff.
This is all so fascinating, but I'm eager to hear more about the other figures who shaped 19th century Scottish philosophy. Who's next on our list of philosophical heavy hitters?
Next, we have James Frederick Ferrier, a passionate defender of Scottish philosophy, even when he took it in directions that some found surprising.
Oh, I love it when a philosopher shakes things up a bit. What made this defender of Scottish thought so rebellious?
Well, Ferrier was deeply proud of his philosophical heritage. He once said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that his philosophy was Scottish to the very core, a natural growth of old Scotland's soil, even if it differed from Reid and Hamilton.
So he's claiming that mantle of Scottish philosophy, but also forging his own path?
Yeah.
Where did he diverge from the traditional Scottish thinkers?
Well, Ferrier was quite critical of common sense philosophy as practiced by some. He believed it focused too much on trivial facts and everyday observations instead of grappling with deeper philosophical truths.
So he's saying that common sense can only take you so far in philosophy.
Exactly. He felt philosophy should delve into fundamental questions about the nature of reality and consciousness, not just catalog everyday beliefs. And here's where it gets really interesting. Ferrier was a staunch defender of Berkeley, a figure often associated with the way of ideas that Reid so vehemently opposed.
Wait a minute, Berkeley, the guy who said to be is to be perceived. That doesn't sound very Scottish, does it?
I know, right? It seems like a complete contradiction. But Ferrier saw a deep connection between Berkeley's idealism and the principles of common sense.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that one.
Uh-huh.
How can idealism, which says that everything is mind-dependent, be aligned with common sense, which seems very grounded in the external world?
Ferrier argued that Berkeley's rejection of matter as a separate substance actually affirmed the reality of our experience by saying, to be is to be perceived.
Yeah.
Berkeley wasn't denying the world's existence. He was challenging the philosophical distinction between things and their appearances.
So for Ferrier, Berkeley wasn't saying that the world only exists in our minds, but that our experience of the world is ultimately real.
Precisely. Ferrier saw this as aligning with the common sense notion that we should trust our immediate experience rather than get lost in abstract metaphysical speculations.
This is blowing my mind a little. So Ferrier took Scottish philosophy in a more idealistic direction, but by embracing a figure often seen as antithetical to the Scottish tradition. What a fascinating twist.
It certainly shows the dynamism and diversity within Scottish thought during this period. But not everyone agreed with this return to idealism. Alexander Bain took Scottish philosophy in a very different direction.
Okay, bring on Bain. What was his unique contribution to this Scottish philosophical landscape?
Bain is significant because he straddled the worlds of philosophy and psychology. He's considered a pioneer of experimental psychology, emphasizing observation and scientific methods in studying the mind.
So a more empirical approach to understanding the mind, that sounds like a departure from the more metaphysical focus of someone like Ferrier.
Absolutely. Bain famously argued that psychology should take precedence over metaphysics, We should understand the mind through observation and experimentation before tackling bigger questions about the nature of reality.
So get the facts straight before speculating about the big picture. That sounds very much in line with the scientific spirit of the 19th century.
Exactly. Bain's emphasis on empirical methods had a profound impact on the development of psychology as a distinct discipline. But he didn't completely abandon philosophical questions. He was particularly interested in associationism.
Associationism. Refresh my memory. What's that all about?
In essence, associationism explains how the mind works by examining how ideas connect in our experience. For example, seeing lightning might make you immediately think of thunder, because those events are often associated in our experience.
So our minds link ideas based on our experiences in the world.
That's the basic idea. Bain saw associationism as key to understanding the mind, even in seemingly irrational states, like dreams or madness. He believed even these states could be explained by how ideas associate in our minds.
So he's looking for underlying patterns of thought, even in what seems chaotic or nonsensical.
Exactly. He sought to identify universal laws of association that could help us make sense of the complexities of human thought. It's interesting to contrast Bain's approach with Ferrier's. Ferrier, as we discussed, was critical of reducing the mind to a machine governed by associations.
Right. Ferrier thought that true philosophy needed to go beyond just describing how the mind works and delve into deeper questions of meaning and consciousness. So we have these contrasting figures, Ferrier and Bain, both pushing Scottish philosophy forward, but in very different directions.
Yeah.
What about the Scottish idealists? How do they fit into this evolving landscape?
The Scottish idealists, figures like Edward Caird and James Hutchison Stirling, were deeply inspired by Hegel, the German philosopher who developed absolute idealism.
Okay, Hegel. That's a name that can inspire awe or dread depending on your philosophical inclinations. What did the Scottish idealists find so appealing about his philosophy?
Well, Hegel's philosophy is notoriously difficult to summarize, but one of its core tenets is that reality is ultimately a unified whole, often called the absolute. Hegel saw history as the unfolding of this absolute, with human thought and culture playing a crucial role. The Scottish idealists saw in Hegel a way to reconcile seemingly contradictory elements of experience, like reason and desire or freedom and necessity.
So instead of seeing these as irreconcilable opposites, they saw them as part of a larger interconnected whole.
Precisely. They were particularly interested in how this Hegelian perspective could illuminate the relationship between the individual mind and the absolute.
I can see how that would be a fascinating puzzle. If reality is ultimately this unified whole, how do we account for the seemingly separate existence of individual minds?
That's a key challenge the Scottish idealists grappled with. They also explored how this Hegelian framework could help us understand the nature of God and the role of religion in human experience.
It sounds like they were tackling some pretty big questions.
Mhm.
How did they see their work in relation to earlier figures in Scottish philosophy, like Hume and Reid?
They saw themselves as building on the insights of the Scottish tradition, but pushing it in new directions. Unlike Hume, they weren't skeptical of metaphysics, they embraced it. And unlike Reid, they weren't content to rely solely on common sense. They wanted to develop a more systematic and comprehensive understanding of reality.
So they were both drawing on and challenging the legacy of Scottish philosophy.
Exactly. This led to some fascinating debates and discussions. One figure particularly critical of both Bain's empiricism and the Scottish idealists' Hegelian leanings was James McCosh.
Okay, McCosh. Where does he fit into this philosophical family tree?
McCosh was a Scottish-born philosopher who became president of Princeton University. He deeply appreciated the Scottish philosophical tradition and felt that both Bain and Caird had strayed too far from its core principles.
So he was a bit of a traditionalist when it came to Scottish philosophy.
You could say that he wanted to hold on to that balance between empirical observation and moral and religious reflection that he saw as the heart of Scottish philosophy.
Right, so it sounds like McCosh wanted to hold on to that balance, between empirical observation and moral and religious reflection that he saw as kind of the heart of Scottish philosophy.
Precisely. He believed that Scottish philosophy was uniquely grounded in both of those realms. He felt that Bain, in focusing so intently on empirical psychology, had kind of neglected the moral and religious dimensions, while Caird, by embracing Hegel so wholeheartedly, had veered too far into abstract metaphysics.
McCosh sounds a bit like a worried parent, seeing his philosophical children going astray. Did he think that Scottish philosophy was doomed to disappear altogether?
Well, he was certainly pessimistic about its future in Scotland, believing that these two diverging paths, represented by Bain and Caird, signaled its decline. Interestingly, though, McCosh predicted that a new, distinctly American philosophy would emerge from the Scottish tradition. He saw the intellectual landscape of America as fertile ground for this new movement.
That's a bold prediction. Did his vision for an American philosophy rooted in Scottish thought ever come to pass?
Well, McCosh's hope for a uniquely American philosophy didn't materialize exactly as he envisioned. However, Scottish philosophy did have a significant impact on American intellectual life in the 19th century. Thinkers like Samuel Stanhope Smith at Princeton and Noah Porter at Yale were deeply influenced by Reid's common sense realism and incorporated it into their teachings.
So Scottish philosophy found a new home in the burgeoning universities of America.
You could say that. And this influence persisted even as American philosophers began engaging more with Kant and other European thinkers. Francis Bowen at Harvard is a great example. He was a staunch defender of the English philosophical tradition, which he saw as encompassing Scottish thinkers like Reid and Dugald Stewart.
It's fascinating how these philosophical ideas crossed the Atlantic. So even as American philosophy was kind of expanding its horizons, it retained this strong connection to the Scottish tradition.
Absolutely. Even C.S. Peirce, considered one of the founders of pragmatism, a quintessentially American philosophical movement, was familiar with Reid and common sensism.
This cross-pollination of ideas is amazing. But back in Scotland, did anyone try to carry the torch of Scottish philosophy into the 20th century, even as McCosh was lamenting its decline?
One figure who made a valiant attempt to synthesize the key insights of Scottish philosophy and ensure its continued relevance was Andrew Seth Pringle Pattison.
Okay, Pringle Pattison. I've heard the name, but I'm not super familiar with his work. What was his main contribution to the Scottish philosophical tradition?
Pringle Pattison was a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and he earnestly sought to bridge the divides that had emerged within Scottish philosophy during the 19th century. He held that Scottish philosophy at its best blended a commitment to experience with a deep concern for moral and religious questions.
It sounds like he was striving to recapture that balance that McCosh was so concerned about losing.
Exactly. His major work, The Idea of God in the Light of Recent Philosophy, attempted to reconcile the insights of both empiricism and idealism. He developed a concept called higher naturalism, which sought to ground philosophy in experience while also recognizing the reality of different orders of mind and the need for a comprehensive explanation of reality.
So he was a true synthesizer, trying to bring together the best of different philosophical approaches. But it sounds like he was facing an uphill battle.
Unfortunately, despite his best efforts, the spotlight on the Scottish tradition was already dimming. Several factors contributed to this decline. The rise of empirical psychology as a distinct discipline drew thinkers away from philosophy departments.
So the science of mind, envisioned by the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, ended up kind of branching off into its own specialized field.
Exactly. And with psychology's rise, there was this growing emphasis on empirical methods and a move away from the grand metaphysical questions that had occupied so many Scottish philosophers.
So the focus shifted from those big questions about the nature of reality to more specific questions about how the mind works. What else contributed to the decline of Scottish philosophy?
Another significant shift was the decline of idealism Caird, and Pringle Pattison tried to synthesize Scottish thought with Hegelian idealism. But by the early 20th century, idealism was losing favor, especially in British and American philosophy.
So those grand sweeping systems of thought that had once seemed so compelling lost their hold on the philosophical imagination.
Precisely. And as idealism declined, so did interest in those Scottish philosophers who had aligned themselves with it. Ironically, Hume, the arch-skeptic, who had been a primary target of the Scottish common sense philosophers, saw his reputation resurge.
What a fascinating turn of events. So Hume, the philosopher who questioned everything, ended up being one of the few Scottish thinkers who remained relevant in the 20th century.
It is a strange twist of fate. It highlights how philosophical trends can shift and change in unpredictable ways.
It's sad to think that figures like Reid and Pringle Pattison, who dedicated so much to developing and defending the Scottish tradition, witnessed its decline into relative obscurity.
It is a bit melancholic, but their work remains waiting to be rediscovered by those interested in the rich history of Scottish thought.
It's been an incredible journey exploring these different facets of Scottish thought. I came into this deep dive thinking it'd be all about Hume and Reid, but there was so much more to discover.
There's always more beneath the surface. That's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. We can delve into a topic's nuances, complexities, and uncover hidden gems of insight.
We've unearthed a treasure trove of philosophical riches today. We've met fascinating characters like Thomas Browne, the bridge builder, and James Frederick Ferrier, the rebellious defender of Scottish ideals. We've grappled with concepts like the unconditioned and explored the intricacies of associationism. And we've seen how the Scottish tradition, even as it declined, shaped intellectual landscapes in both Scotland and America.
What a journey it's been. I think the most important takeaway is that Scottish philosophy, even in its 19th century form, remains relevant today. It reminds us to value experience, question assumptions, and seek a comprehensive understanding of ourselves and the world.
It's like they offer a fresh perspective, a new way to approach those enduring philosophical questions that continue to fascinate and challenge us.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe revisiting these thinkers and engaging with their ideas will inspire us to tackle some of the pressing issues of our time. Imagine the insights figures like McCosh or Pringle Pattison might offer on contemporary debates about consciousness, artificial intelligence, or the role of science in understanding human nature.
That's an intriguing thought. We're essentially giving our listeners a challenge, inviting them to continue this exploration and consider how these 19th century Scottish thinkers might speak to the concerns of the 21st century.
I love that. It's all about keeping that spirit of inquiry alive, that willingness to delve deep and wrestle with those big, challenging questions.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into 19th century Scottish philosophy. I hope you've enjoyed this journey as much as we have.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We hope you'll continue exploring the fascinating world of philosophy and keep those minds curious. Until next time, happy diving.